Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with our first matchup analysis, this time with two of the top dogs in the modern format. As a friendly reminder, if you do like informative modern content, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below, letting me know what you think of this matchup overview. So the two decks in question are Izzet Murktide and 4-color Urion, mainly the counterspell control variant. The two decks are arguably the top two decks in the format, and they do go head-to-head in quite a few tournaments, so you do need to be aware about how the matchups kind of shape up with kind of the preferred lists that you tend to see, or the default lists you might see with a lot of these variants. As far as the Izzet Murktide list, they've kind of moved away from Dragon Rage Channeler a lot, so you're seeing a lot of Ragavan, Ledger Shredder, 3 copies of Izzet Murktide lists, but a lot of the other things are still the same. You're still seeing the Unholy Heats, Lightning Bolts. You're still seeing things like Counterspell and Archmage's Charm in some number, Expressive Iteration being a key card, and then Spell Pierce as early interaction. Mishra's Bauble to help trigger Shredder and put cards in your graveyard for Murktide. And this deck is very much a tempo-oriented deck that tries to get on the board early, and as such in the matchup, that is important for it to focus on. It's got to get on the battlefield early with a quick Ragavan or Ledger Shredder, or try to get a Murktide on the battlefield fairly quickly and protect it. This is not a matchup where they can afford to try to leverage their own sources of card advantage very much. While they do have Expressive Iteration and Archmage's Charm, oftentimes the 4-color deck is just going to simply overpower you if you don't have a clock going, because simply most of their cards have draw cards stapled to whatever they have going on. As far as the sideboard, the key cards that you're looking at in a lot of these situations are your extra counter spells and your extra copies of any type of card advantage. Blood Moon is kind of enticing, but oftentimes the 4-color deck can play around it, so it's not really worth bringing in a lot of the times. Simply put, a lot of the times they're playing Magus and Moon in their own sideboard, and it's not really worth bringing in. The cards you would likely bring in with this particular style of list: Jace the Mind Sculptor to give you an alternative win con, as well as a little bit of card advantage for the mid-game, Mystical Dispute to deal with a lot of their key spells, which happen to be blue as well, and then Flusterstorm to be able to fight the counter wars that you need to win to either protect your creatures or to keep one of their main threats from resolving. As far as cards you would consider boarding out, Spell Pierce will quickly run out of steam, and a lot of their threats are not Planeswalker or spell-based, but it can be important. Flusterstorm is just a little bit better as far as fighting the counter wars. Dress Down, while it can be tempting to leave this in against something like an Elementals deck, giving them free Evoke Elementals doesn't seem very good. And then 3 copies of Lightning Bolt, because it doesn't really interact with a lot of their stuff profitably, but you do need to leave some amount of Unholy Heats and Bolts in to deal with their permanents that you can't just plow through with your various creatures in order to pressure their planeswalkers. That said, the key things for this deck is to be the early aggressor and to finish the game, or to get a Murktide down and try to finish the game as quickly as possible, and then the fight's over protecting those threats or keeping your opponent's threats from resolving. From the 4-color side, their inevitability is the key. They have things like Teferi that make the game very problematic for Murktide to play, as Murktide likes to play at instant speed a lot. They have a lot of early removal for things like Ragavan and Ledger Shredder, so often it comes down to a resolved Murktide Regent being able to win the game. If you happen to find one of your answers to that, whether it be a counterspell at a key turn, solituding it if it happens to be small enough, furying it, bouncing it with a Teferi, anything you can kind of do to keep their threats off the battlefield. And then overall, otherwise, you're just going to simply outcard them as the game goes on. Almost every card you're playing: Abundant Growth, Icefang Coatl, Brennan 6, Eldamari's Call, Expressive Iteration, Omnath, Teferi, Fury, Solitude if you're casting them. Almost every single one of these cards is multiple sources of card advantage. Solitude, kill a creature, leave a 3/2 body behind. Fury, kill a Ragavan, leave a 3/3 double striker behind. Omnath, come down, draw a card, put you ahead on mana if you have a fetch land. Teferi, come down, bounce their Murktide to their hand, Ledger Shredder to their hand. The longer the game goes, the more it's in 4-color's favor. That said, Murktide can win a mid to late game, with an unanswered Ragavan in the mid to game if everybody's low on resources, or a Murktide Regent that's a 7/7 or an 8/8, getting in for 2 hits if they can't find a Solitude or a Teferi to answer it if it's resolved. But once again, the game kind of comes down to resolving your own big threat if you're on the 4-color side, and answering the early threats out of the Izzet Murktide side or answering the Murktide. So that end, you're bringing in stuff that kind of stabilizes in those situations. You know, you're bringing in cards like, in this particular build, you would be bringing in cards like Veil of Summer, Supreme Verdict, Endurance to deal with, try to keep their Murktides off the board. You might also bring in a copy of Relic of Progenitus, depending on how many cards you want to fight, and then Flusterstorm is another card you would probably consider bringing in. The rest of these cards, you know, you could consider bringing in Chalice, but it's a little bit slow in a lot of situations, and they're going to trim on some of their 1-mana cards anyway. And I guess the Moon, once again, would be tempting, but they're a Blood Moon deck themselves. So these are the 6 or 7 cards you would consider bringing in. You know, Relic and Endurance help fight against the Murktide regions. If they happen to be the Dragon Rage's Channeler, you're even more incentivized to bring in Relic. Veil of Summer and Flusterstorm to help resolve your key spells. Supreme Verdict, obviously, to keep their board clear of Murktides and stuff, and it being an uncounterable threat. Ephemerate, while it is interesting to get a lot of value off your cards, you know, this is very much an attrition thing, and if you don't happen to get resolve, want to leave it on the battlefield, this would be a reason to board it out. Boarding out one or two copies of Ragavan, especially when you're on the draw, as they're going to be advantage to getting things on the battlefield. So that while this does put pressure on them to have an early removal spell, it is certainly a card you can consider removing. Eldamari's Call, a little bit clunky if you're trying to get in the mid to late game, especially in the early turns when you can't really afford to be spending 2 mana to go find a thing. And Eldamari's Call is more often whenever you're trying to tutor for a particular bullet, like a Magus of the Moon against Tron or Amulet or something, and a little bit less in a matchup that's more about card advantage and tempo. Other cards you would consider bringing out, obviously Emrakul, while it'd be great to have this, you know, that's very difficult for Murktide to deal with this profitably. Even with a counterspell, you still get to control their turn. However, you know, it's still a little bit slow and clunky for this style of matchup. Another card we've already kind of talked about, you really don't want to leave in Dress Down against Murktide. This is more for the Urza's Saga decks. And finally, you might also consider boarding out a counterspell or shaving on something else that you might need just to be able to get all the cards in that you want to come in that they're a little bit more efficient than counterspell at protecting your own spells or keeping your opponent's spells from resolving. That said, you know, both games can win in the mid to late. Both decks can win in the mid to late game, but the more the game goes beyond turn 5 or 6, the more it probably favors the 4-color Omnath player, as they simply have more card advantage going in the mid to late game. That said, you know, Murktide does have Expressive Iteration, Archmage's Charm. Considered, they're still going to see a bunch of cards, they still can steal the game, but once the balance of the turns is like turn 5 or 6. If anything goes beyond that and the Murktide player isn't significantly ahead at that point, the game is likely going to end up going to the 4-color Omnath player. There is no like one particular card on the 4-color side that really swings the matchup, although Teferi and Solitude are both very important. Icefang Coatl can be very important, especially if you have enough snow basics in play to make it Death Touch, making it difficult swinging with their Ledger Shredders and Murktide regions. And from the other side, the 2 main cards are obviously Ragavan and Murktide Regent. Ledger Shredder can be relevant in terms of card selection and just being a flying threat. However, Ragavan can run away with the game on its own, and Murktide can threaten to end the game very quickly. So those are kind of what you're boiled down to. It's the early game. Can you answer their early threats? Can you resolve your own big thing? And then can you keep them from keeping a Murktide on the battlefield? If you're the 4-color side, that's kind of the strategy if you're trying to execute. If you're on the Izzet Murktide side, you're trying to execute the more of the tempo strategy. Get an early threat down, try to tempo them out, you know, keep their threats off the board, keep your threat on the board, especially if it's a Murktide, to try to win the game very quickly. And, you know, like I said, both decks can win late, but later game definitely tends to favor the 4-color Omnath piles. Now, things obviously switch up a little bit if they're on the Elemental version, but we're mainly sticking to covering the traditional 4-color Omnath variant in this particular video. Let me know how you like these kinds of matchup breakdowns, if these are some things you'd be interested in for some of the top decks in the format, and letting me know what decks you might like to see broken down in the next video.